everyone, welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. This is my January reading wrap-up. In January I read 8 books, 2 non-fiction and 6 fiction. I've been thinking about how I wanted to do wrap-ups, and I think I'm going to do fiction from my least favourite to favourite, followed by non-fiction in order of reading, as I find it really hard to rank non-fiction, especially if they're in different categories or about different subjects. It's just like, I don't know, it just because you enjoy the content of one more doesn't make it a better book. That's why I'm going to go with order of reading. I actually thought I hadn't read that much this month, as I was really busy at work, but must have read more than I thought, and just some really good books here as well, so that's great. So into the books. So the first book I'm going to talk about is The Secret Guests by Benjamin Black. Benjamin Black is the Irish author John Banville's pen name when he writes more crime fiction or suspense novels. This is actually a really recent purchase for me. The cover, I suppose, really drew me in, with the 2 girls in the old-fashioned coats, and just reading the premise it sounded really interesting, so I picked it up second hand. So this book imagines a situation where the Princess Elizabeth and Margaret were sent to Ireland during the Blitz in the Second World War, as Ireland was neutral, and they're sent to live in this estate in Tipperary, and that sounded like it had plenty of potential to be interesting, to examine Ireland's neutrality and recent independence, and how people in the surroundings would react to princesses being in their midst. However, I have to admit that the extent to which this is explored in the book was quite limited. Obviously their presence had to be kept a secret, but I thought that maybe it might get out and that side of things would be explored, but it was mostly about the Duke that they were staying with and the 2 minders that were assigned to them. So one is a female MI6 agent called Celia, and the other is Detective Garda Strafford. I thought it'd be much more interesting if Strafford was kind of a more typical Garda of the time, but he's from an Anglo-Irish background as well and is Protestant, which is why he's sent to look after them, because as his boss said, he'd be able to, you know, link with the Duke better because when he was familiar with that world. But it does mean that all of the Anglo-Irish characters were really well explored, and the, how would you call them, like native Irish, were very 2D characters and had limited roles, when I thought it'd be way more interesting if they were more involved in the plot. But that's not to say that I didn't like Detective Strafford. I thought he was a really good character, and after I finished this I found out that the other novel recently released by John Banville that I've seen, called Snow, focuses on that character more. I probably will pick that up because John Banville / Benjamin Black definitely can write. I've read his quirk novels before, which admittedly do focus on a similar class, and that seems to be his area of strength, and that's fine. As I said, the quirk novels are really good. There's also kind of some fun links between them, like characters that appear in quirk appear here, and obviously Strafford appears in this book as well as Snow. But yeah, it was just a little bit disappointing, I suppose. It's not even really that much about the princesses, it's more about Celia and Strafford and how they cope with the security threats to the princesses, really. Another thing I have to say about this, I suppose just a bit personal, is I wish the Irish authorities hadn't come across as so incompetent. I don't know how reflective of real life that is, but yeah, I don't know, it's supposed to be a nicer reading experience if, yeah. I especially found the ending was really rushed. I don't want to spoil it, but 2 of the characters had this scene in like the last, it must have been like the last 15 pages or something, and it just seemed so random and thrown in there. I think this had the potential to be a really good book if it was a lot longer, and as I said, some of the Irish characters were explored a lot more and had their own plot lines. I wish it fulfilled more of the promise, really, and that's what I'll say about The Secret Guests. But it still was a really fun read. I did read it in less than 24 hours. It's quite a short book. This hardback edition is just under 300 pages, so I'd recommend, if you're just looking for a quick paced, you know, read that is enjoyable, but just don't expect too much from it. So the next book I'm going to talk about is A Battle Won by Sean Thomas Russell. This is the third book of 4 in the Charles Hayden series. Charles Hayden, I'm not sure what way his name is supposed to be pronounced, so apologies about that. This book follows the career of a certain Charles Hayden, who serves in the Royal Navy. He's quite interesting as his mother was French and his father is British, so that conflict comes up quite regularly for him. This book was really enjoyable, fast-paced, they're always good reads, even if they never quite reached the same heights as the first book in the series, Under Enemy Colours, which was really, really excellent. The characters, both Charles Hayden himself and his shipmates, are really enjoyable to read about, and there is a storyline set on land as well, which I have to admit I didn't enjoy quite so much. I think the family that it follows, it's quite unrealistic the way that they're depicted. However, the on land storyline does culminate in quite a surprising and novel way. I think I liked it. It's one of those endings where it took me a while to make up my mind about it, but I think I liked it. So unfortunately there's only one more book left in this series, but I'm sure I'll come back and reread them because they just genuinely are a good time, and I think they're really accessible if anybody is interested in getting into this kind of fiction. Definitely more so than the Patrick O'Brien's, which I think I prefer overall, but definitely require a lot more concentration and Google. Yeah. So the next book I'm going to talk about is The North Water by Ian McGuire. This was published in 2016, however I've noticed it appear more recently in bookshops and have enjoyed a surge in popularity as there's been a television series. I've watched the first episode of the television series and I will have to catch up on the rest. However, this book is set in 1859 and it's principally about this man called Patrick Sumners, who incidentally is an Irishman. He was serving as a surgeon in the British Army in India, but he was dismissed and he instead joins this whaling ship which is travelling up to the Arctic to obviously catch whales. And anybody that is put off by the words whaling, as I was, and hadn't read this book for a while as a result, because I read Moby Dick and there was way too much detail about whaling in that book for me. This book is not so in-depth about whaling, so have no fear. It's not so much about whaling as about certain incidents that happen in the ship, particularly to do with this Henry Drax. He's the harpooner and a very violent man. That's not a spoiler, it's in the first few pages of the book or the first few minutes of the television series. I did really enjoy this book. It was very engaging and I finished it within a day in a few sittings before we went back to work after Christmas. However, in terms of being set in the Arctic, it wasn't as much my taste as more of a suspense novel than the kind of men versus nature novel, which I enjoy. Like memorably The Terror by Dan Simmons, that'd be more my taste. But that's just a personal opinion and I still would really recommend this book anyways. I'll have to finish the television series before I can give an opinion on that one. One of the best parts of the book, in my opinion, was the storyline to do with why Sumner was dismissed from the army in India. That was a really good mystery, I suppose, as to why it happened and his feelings about it afterwards. Yeah, would recommend. So the next book I'm going to talk about is Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. This is the first Persephone classic I've ever read. I was in London at the end of last year and I picked it up in Hatchards, and definitely won't be the last one. I have 2 more already that are on my TBR, and I must say they're very nice books to read. I love these kind of, are they called French flaps? The text is a really nice size and it has little illustrations in the original illustrations, I believe, which are lovely. So this book was published in 1938. I haven't read many books from this era and it was a nice change. So I know this is a very popular book on BookTube and I think that it may be Lil from Lil's Vintage World favourite book, so I had high expectations going in, but they weren't disappointed. So the premise of this book is Miss Pettigrew, a governess, turns up to this job expecting to be looking after children, but she actually is sent to the wrong place and ends up with this socialite called Miss LaFosse, and instead goes around with Miss LaFosse for her day. And obviously this is a really novel situation to Miss Pettigrew. I was really surprised by kind of how straitened circumstances she was in at the start of the book as a governess. Like, she said that she's on the edge of having to go to the workhouse. Miss Pettigrew is, she's had a very limited life. She's quite poor. She is a governess but doesn't really enjoy it, so her glimpse into Miss LaFosse's glamorous life and her reactions to everything that go on are so funny, and I just love the ending. I thought it was perfect, and yeah, just a very good book overall, I have to say. So my second favourite fiction read of the month was actually a reread, and it was Sharpe's Eagle by Bernard Cornwell. Last year I read all of the Sharpe series, actually apart from the last one in chronological order, Sharpe's Devil. I read them in chronological order, which I really enjoyed. I really liked following Sharpe throughout the series, and if you're a little bit less familiar at least with the land aspect of the Napoleonic Wars, it's probably easier to read that way. So Sharpe's Eagle was actually the first one published, so it was published in 1981, but it's quite far down the list chronologically. So when I first read the Sharpe series, I thought this one, Sharpe's Eagle, was one of the best ones. I read it in a night. I remember finishing it. I think I started it at like 9 o'clock at night on a weeknight, and finished it at about 3 in the morning because I just couldn't stop reading. It was so good. One week this month I just had a really long week at work, really, and I just needed escapism and comfort, so I decided to go back and read Sharpe's Eagle. And to be honest, I probably will keep reading the Sharpe books when I need them at times like that, but I think I'll read them this time in publication order and see what difference that makes. So to talk about this one, it's hard not to give spoilers if you do read them in chronological order. If you have somehow avoided knowing anything about Sharpe, the television series starring Sean Bean is quite famous, and I believe a lot of people have heard of Sharpe. But anyways, if you have somehow managed to avoid hearing about Sharpe, would like to read these books and would like to avoid spoilers for reading him in chronological order, stop listening now and you can tune in again when I put the book down. So the whole premise of Sharpe, and I love Sharpe as a character. I think he's one of my favourite fictional characters ever. Is he was promoted from the ranks, which is very difficult to achieve back in the late 18th century, early 19th century, for an act of suicidal bravery is how it's described. He saves the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley's life in India, and therefore he's given his commission. At this point in the book he is a lieutenant. Really the books are half about Sharpe fighting the French and half about him fighting fellow officers, especially his superiors, who sometimes aren't very competent. And this book really stars one of the best incompetent superiors of the whole series. That's Simmerson. He is absolutely ridiculous, and yeah, this is such a good book. It's about the Battle of Talavera, and all of the best characters in Sharpe are in this. So Sharpe himself, obviously, and his sidekick, Sergeant Harper, and one of his superiors, Hogan, who's an intelligence officer, who's also really great. Yeah, I would highly recommend Sharpe's Eagle, but I think if you're in it for the long haul, maybe just think about whether you would like to read them in publication order, where they do go back and forth a little bit, or chronological order. I know people have said in chronological order there are some inconsistencies with such a long running series, like the latest book in the series just published just before Christmas, Sharpe's Assassin, which I thought was a brilliant into the series. Yeah, just have a think about it, but if you just want to dip your toes in and don't really mind about spoilers for his overall storyline, like if you look at a 22 book series about one character, you probably would guess that he's not going to stay as a private the whole time. He's probably going to get promoted. Yeah, maybe try chronological order. I thought the first books, which are set in India, are really, really good. So the last fiction book I'm going to talk about, and my favourite fiction book for January, was actually one I got for Christmas, and that is We the Drowned by Carsten Jensen, translated from the Danish, as I do not speak Danish. So first of all, look at the cover. It's so beautiful, with the white and blue, and really captures so many elements of the story and kind of the timeline that it takes place over. So there's the sailing ship here that's obviously 19th century, and then planes and more modern warship here. And that's because this book starts off in 1848 and goes all the way through to 1945, so it follows 4 kind of generations, and it is a very long book. Like, it's almost 700 pages, but it didn't feel long at all, and because it is kind of split up into the different generations, it didn't drag. I thought it was so immersive when I was reading it, and when I read it I tended to read like 50 to 100 pages at a time. Like, it was so hard to leave the characters, and it's kind of broken up in a really nice way. There's different kind of large sections, I think 4 of them, and yeah, 4, and then there's like 3 to 4 chapters within those. However, the chapters themselves are kind of broken up into smaller sections, so you can read as much as or as little as you want in a single sitting, which is nice. The scope is so huge, and it took me way too long to realise this, but I was wondering who was narrating, but it's actually being narrated by the drowned of the title. Like, is kind of an omniscient narrator, so that was a really interesting mechanism. But yeah, like, don't let the the fact that it's translated or the narration style put you off, because I thought it was really accessible, and I was afraid that I'm not that familiar with Denmark. It's all kind of centred around this town of Marstal, but it was really easy to follow. The language was beautiful. There's so many kind of interesting sections in it. Like, for somebody I suppose that reads a lot of books about sailors like me, there's a lot of kind of musings about drowning. It sounds a bit morose, but they really were described really well, and kind of how the seamen viewed the dangers of that. In terms of which storylines I enjoyed most, they were all really good, but I have to say my favourite was Nud Eric's, I hope that's how you pronounce it, Knud is his first name. His storyline was in the Second World War, and I'd actually never read it. For all the books I've read about the sea, I've never read about sailors in the Second World War before, so it was interesting to read about life on a more modern ship, and the way he deals with the awful things that happen in the war are very interestingly described. It really explores really well the impact that it has on him being involved in such a terrible time, with the cost of so many lives and such danger. There's also a very slight kind of magical realism in this book, where one character has visions in his dreams of the future, and if I remember correctly, the character that has the vision, he was on ships in the First World War, but he has a vision of the Second World War, and airplanes dropping bombs, and he cannot understand what he's seeing. Like, he thinks that it must be the end of the world, but the reader knows that he is just foreseeing the Second World War. So that was, I suppose, horrifying and interesting at the same time. You wouldn't expect in a book about the sea for there to be many female characters. However, in this one there is, seeing as it's not all set on ship. Like, there is some set in Marstal, and sometimes the storyline focuses just on the events on land. Clara is a really interesting character. She's lives in Marstal, but she really doesn't like the sea and what it has done to the town, so her storyline was different and really well explored. There is a storyline where one of the characters marries quite late in life. This is a storyline involving a really horrible teacher and kind of the trial and tribulations of a set of schoolboys and their growing up, and that's what's interesting really, when like that generation you kind of get to follow them, and they leave for a few years and meet again, and how that works out, and sometimes they meet in very surprising circumstances. So it was just a great cast of characters to follow, and a book I'll definitely be returning to. So the first of 2 non-fiction books that I'm going to talk about is another book with a beautiful cover, Eavesdropping on Jane Austen's England by Roy and Lesley Adkins. It's kind of fake embroidery on the cover, which is really nice, with all the different kind of motifs of what life in Jane Austen's England would have looked like. So I've read many of the Adkins's books before. You can actually see them behind me there. I think they might be my favourite historians public historians that I've read. They write in such an interesting and engaging way about life in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Their previous book that I've read is more about like naval history. However, this book is more about everyday life, and the chapters really capture that. So it kind of tells the story story in order of a person's life, so starting off with wedding bells and into breeding, which is about pregnancy and childbirth, which is a really interesting chapter. Toddler to teenager, wealth and work, on the move, medicine men, and last words, to name just a few. What I love about the Adkins' work is they tell the story, but also they include like so many primary sources, like quotations from like diaries and letters, which are really interesting and really bring it into the time. I have to say my favourite chapter was probably on highwaymen. It was I hadn't read that much about them before. I have read histories of this time before, probably noticeably In These Times by Jenny Uglow, and while this isn't as in depth as that book, it's a really good launching place, and it's definitely gives you a really good overview. I would recommend, along with all of the Adkins' other books. So the last book I'm going to talk about today, I also picked up when I was in London in the National Maritime Museum, and this was The Anarchy by William Dalrymple. So the subtitle of this book is The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. Given that I do read so many books set during the Napoleonic Wars especially, there's always the East India Company is mentioned, East Indiamen ships, and like I just mentioned, this is actually the book that spurred me wanting to read Sharpe again, because the first 3 Sharpe books in chronological order are set in India. So obviously I'd always been aware of the British connection with India, but that about was the extent of my knowledge. I didn't really know how it started. I knew it was something to do with the East India Company, but after being in the National Maritime Museum, they did have this video on the East India Company, and spoke to people from India about how they felt about it, and that really made me want to go to the bookshop and pick up a book to find out more about it. This book was there, and it seems to be quite a well-known one. I see it's one of Barack Obama's best books of 2019 and the Times History Book of the Year. So I thought it would be a good place to start, and I have to say it was such an engaging read, and for somebody that really knew very little about Indian history, it gave a good overview. Obviously limited just to the scope of India's interaction with the East India Company, which meant that it started in what was it? The first chapter is called 1599, but like it did such a good job of kind of explaining about the different parts of India and the different rulers within India at that time and throughout the regime of the East India Company, to somebody with no knowledge of it. Time and time again in this book it's kind of hammered home. It was so horrifying that all of this was perpetrated by a private company, not even by a country. So it wasn't Britain that conquered India, it was the East India Company, which was for-profit company that conquered India, and the way that India was exploited was absolutely horrific to read, but it was important that I got this background. It's filled with loads of paintings, not just of East India Company officials but also the Indian rulers of the time. One thing I have to say that was really good about this as a history book as well was there was a section at the start, Dramatis Personae, which kind of went through the different figures that you read about in the different factions, and it really stopped you getting too lost when there was a lot of names that you hadn't come across before, and I think that should be in more history books. It was really useful. So a difficult read at times just because of what was done and how it was allowed to happen, but would highly recommend this book if you're interested in history of this time. So that's all the books I have to talk about for January. I am in the middle of some other books, including The Absentee by Maria Edgeworth, which I'm really enjoying, but I don't think I'll get to finish that by the end of January. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next Thursday.